Okay, so this is a walkthrough of the subjunctive forms. Subjunctive is a type of verb that is the last thing that we need to learn in Latin 2, and it is the third and final mood of a verb that we will learn. The previous two moods that we have learned before were the indicative and the imperative. Of course, you know the imperative is the verb when its form indicates that the expression is a command, and the indicative is similar to the subjunctive in that it will have all of the subjects, I, you, he, we, all, they, as expressed by the same endings that we have seen so far, mst, mustis, nt, aris, tur, murmini, and tur. But the subjunctive form is going to be a form that is indicating a certain non-specificity, non-specific possibility of the action. In English, the way that we deal with subjunctives is that we use particular helping verbs. There are some helping verbs that we use in English that indicate the action is a fact. We say things like, I am running, we are running, or I have run, or I will run, in various different tenses that I've just expressed, but they are all fact. In English, the subjunctive is expressed by things that would be I might run, I may run, I would run, I could run, and those sorts of things like that. In Latin, you'll know that a verb is subjunctive by its form, as with everything else. Remember the mantra that the answer is because of the form. And so here we're going to walk through and to see what these subjunctive forms look like. Now, there will be other study guides, hopefully walkthroughs, that will indicate why verbs will be in subjunctive in Latin. There are certain clauses that demand a non-specific, non-indicative expression, and that is the time in which, obviously, the subjunctive is employed. So, there are four tenses that the subjunctive is going to express itself in. The two tenses that will not have subjunctives are future tense, because in and of itself, in some ways, the future does have a non-specific possibility. I can say, I will eat dinner tonight, but I don't know that I will. And I could, of course, have all sorts of possibility built within it. The other is future perfect because, again, both future and future perfect occur in the future. It's just that future perfect indicate an action completed in the future. So these are then the tenses, and we're going to walk through them. The first is the present tense. The present tense subjunctive is formed exactly like the indicative. It will have, as you can see here, a present stem. It will have a present vowel. It will have a present ending. And those present endings are the exact same. MST, must, tis, nt. Note that I use M instead of an O. And R, ris, tur, more, many, intor. So all of that should be obviously familiar. The present stem, we all know, as we have said it 1,000 times. Second principal part is the present active infinitive. The present active infinitive gives the conjugation and the present stem. It is in the vowels that would be the differentiation between the subjunctive and the indicative. You can easily remember what the vowels are for the subjunctive by the silly little saying, we fear a giant liar. And here within it, you can see we fear a giant liar. And in that way, those vowels are different than the indicative. Now, if we quickly look back at the indicative, there they are, you can see that your present vowels, as I've written them on the board a million times, would be A, E, I, and long I. And of course, we all know that there are certain endings, as you can see over here, the OM, TNT, R, and intor. They sometimes eat macrons and cause them to be, short or appear short. And there are times in which there are even endings that cause vowels to change. For example, we all know that in the equations that we have right here, the I plus an NT equals unt, E plus an M, E plus an R, and I plus a ris, short I that is, ends up being eris. But those are the vowels that we have learned so far. When it comes to the subjunctives, these new vowels are then the only way that we can tell whether the verb that we are looking at is a present indicative or present subjunctive. However, in many ways, I would say that the present subjunctive is the most difficult, simply because there are vowels whose possibility would allow it to be either present subjunctive or present indicative, and we have to know the conjugation of the verb. That is why we in class repeat the principal parts ad nauseum to the point of being sick of it, because the more that you repeat them, the easier it is to figure out and know what the conjugation is. That's why it's amo, amare, and video, videre, mito, mittere, and so forth and so on, because particularly there are some vowels, and we will see here, that are more tricky. The first vowel that was tricky to begin with was a long E. Remember, when it was a long E previously, you have to ask the question, is it second conjugation or is it third conjugation? Because if you had a long E and it was the vowel in a second conjugation verb, we're talking about a present indicative. And if it were in a third, it'd be a future indicative. Now we have to ask it, is it a long E in a first conjugation verb? Because then it would be a subjunctive form. The other trouble now is going to be a long A. A long A is going to be the same as what you would find in the first conjugation indicative, but now it is also going to be in the third conjugation. So if you were to see a regular old verb with an A or an E, you really have to know what conjugation the verb is in order to be able to tell whether we're dealing with a subjunctive, we fear a giant liar vowel, or whether it is an indicative, the regular old vowels that we have seen so far. Now, note the examples that I've given to you. And I've just taken the verb of every single one that you would see as far as the conjugations are concerned, and shown you the difference between the two of them and what they would look like if it is going to be a subjunctive versus an indicative. And all of these, just for the sake of the example, are in the third person singular. So look, amat, amator turns into the subjunctive amet, amator. Videt, videator in the indicative turns into videat, videator. Mitit, mitator turns into mitat, mitator, and so forth and so on. Now, of these vowels that you have in the subjunctive, these are the ones that are easiest, because an EA only can be a subjunctive, whereas an A here in the subjunctive is that same A that you see in the indicative, just with verbs of different conjugation. Amo, amare, first conjugation, mito, mitere, third conjugation. And so you really, really have to know what the conjugation of the verb is, and that's why, like I said, we repeat it so often. You got to know the conjugation, because it might be subjunctive here or it might be indicative here, dependent upon what conjugation each of those vowels appear in. Now, I'm going to move on to the second tense of subjunctive, which is the imperfect, without talking about translating the subjunctive, because the way that you translate the subjunctive is entirely dependent upon what kind of a clause that it is in. And so, in that way, the clause will dictate it. And so, of course, without being clauses, these are just showing you the forms. We're first concentrating only upon what it looks like. Now, the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense is, I would argue, maybe along with the pluperfect, the easiest subjunctive form to recognize. Long gone are the days of the BA that comes and punches you in the face. That is no more. Instead, the imperfect subjunctive, and that is the first type of subjunctive that is introduced to you by Ecce Romani, is going to be nothing more than the present active infinitive plus your present endings. Now, hopefully we can easily remember what those infinitives look like. Remember, they are going to be with those forms, are, ere, and ire for each of the conjugations, and you see them down here, amare, videre, mitere, audire. You simply take those forms and you slap the endings on them. MST, mustis, inti, if it is a present, or I should say imperfect active subjunctive, and aris, tur, mermini, and tor, you put those on these guys right here if it is a passive imperfect subjunctive. So again, I give you examples of each of these. Amare turned into amarem, amarer, amares, amareris, amaret, amaretur. Again, it's nothing more than the infinitive with the ending mst, and over here mustis inti, and then the same thing for the passive. And I've done this for all of them. Hopefully, if you ever see an imperfect subjunctive, it is easily recognizable simply because, again, present infinitive with an ending. Present infinitive with an ending. And it's a present active infinitive, and the ending is either active, mst, mustis inti, or passive, aris tur, mermini intor. And so you can see them all there. Didn't take much for imperfect subjunctives, and they are really easy to recognize. The third is the perfect tense. Now, it can be slightly tricky, but it's manageable. The reason why it is tricky is, first of all, in the active. And for the perfect tense, I've divided up into first only talking about the active, and then I'll talk about the passive, because as we've seen in indicative verbs as well, and so I can quickly go to my indicative study guide that I have here, that when it comes to the perfect, remember that the perfect tense is going to have two kinds of forms, particularly if it is active, in which it'll have perfect stem plus your perfect endings indicative, isti, it, emis, istis, erunt, or ere. But when it turns into the passive, obviously, it then will have, and I don't have the passive here because this is designed for Latin 1, a periphrastic form. Remember, that is two words, one verbal expression. So let's first deal with the active. Perfect active tense. The perfect is going to have a perfect active stem, and instead of your perfect indicative endings, which remember were isti, it, you have your perfect subjunctive endings. Now, your perfect subjunctive endings for the active are very, very similar to the future perfect endings. Remember that future perfect in the indicative was ero, eris, erit, eremis, eritis, erint. Well, the perfect subjunctive endings are erim, eris, erit, eremis, eritis, erint. So in that way, what you can see is that the 6 forms of the perfect subjunctive forms, 6 of them, 5 would be absolutely identical to the future perfect indicative. So take a look at, let's go with audi, audire. For all the forms that you have, audiveris, that could be a either future perfect indicative or perfect subjunctive. It could be either one. 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 The only one in which it is clear that we're dealing with the subjunctive perfect and not the future perfect indicative is the erim versus the ero. But again, the forms, how will you know whether it is going to be a future perfect indicative or a perfect subjunctive? Context. And we'll have more on that later when we see what kind of clauses subjunctive verbs are in and why they are in those particular clauses. Now, moving on to perfect tense passive. For the passive, again, it's going to be a periphrastic. And remember that the periphrastic as a term literally means a roundabout way of saying something because you have 2 parts to it. One part is going to be a participle. The other part is going to be a form of the verb to be. We have that in English. I used an example earlier. We are running. Are running is the verb. Are is the form of the verb to be, and running is a present active participle. And so that is a present active periphrastic. Well, since we are dealing with perfect tense, the participle that we will use is the perfect passive participle. Remember that the perfect passive participle is the 4th principal part, and then the present subjunctive of the verb to be. Now, in the indicative, remember, it would be the present indicative that we would have. And so you would have, as the example here, actus est. And of course, sum es est, sumus est sunt. And then again, visus est, misus est, iactus est, auditus est. But the subjunctive equivalency of an est is the sit. So now we're going to cut to my irregular subjunctive study guide, which I will obviously make available for you as well. So here they are. Subjunctive forms of irregular verbs. The great news is that only the present tense of the irregular verbs in the subjunctive are the ones that you need to memorize because all of the others follow the pattern. For example, if we look at the imperfect tense, I'm sorry, I'm outside today and the pollen is getting to me a little bit. The imperfect tense would take the infinitive, in this instance, esse, and you would just put your various endings on them. M-S-T, must, tis, int. The perfect tense, you would again take the perfect stem and you would put your perfect subjunctive endings. Erem, eris, erit, eremis, eritis, erint. And for the pluperfect, it would follow that pattern too. We haven't gotten to it as of yet. So here are the present subjunctives for sum esse, sim, sis, sit, Simis it is sint instead of sum es est, sumus estis sunt. Over here, eam easeat, eamus eatis. That form there, if you've ever gone to the convention, you would say it, eamus aquili, and it has the translation, let us go, or let's go Eagles, and that's why we use the subjunctive form. Volo is willem willis willit, willemus willitus willint, and then nolo nolim nolis nolit, nolimus nolitus nolint, and then pharaoh pharam pharas pharat, pharamus pharatus pharant, and then for fio fieri factusum, which is the passive of the verb facio facere feci factus, fiam fias fiat, fiamus fiatus fiant. But the one that we need to concentrate on for the perfect subjunctive passive is the sim sis sit simis sitis sint. So going back to the subjunctive overview, you can see that actus est turns into actus sit because est is the equivalency to the sit. Indicative of the verb to be, sum es est. Subjunctive of the verb to be, sim sis sit. And so if we wanted instead of third person singular, it would be, I don't know, first person plural. You would then have, of course, acti or acti or acta. It would have to be plural in the participle as well in the nominative. And it would then have sumus. And over here in the subjunctive, again, acti, acti, acta has to be plural. You would have simus instead of the sumus. And that's how you know that it is a perfect tense passive subjunctive. Now, we move on to the final pluperfect tense. Again, there are only 4 tenses, and those 4 tenses are present, imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect, no future. That automatically implies possibility, and of course then no future perfect, which also occurs in the future, which inherently has some possibility. Now, pluperfect tense is rather like the imperfect tense. Remember that the imperfect tense took the present infinitive, added an ending. Here, for the pluperfect, you're going to take a perfect infinitive. And then again, add your endings, mst, mus, tis, nt. Now, for the pluperfect tense, you have the perfect infinitive active, when you want it to be an active pluperfect subjunctive. And you will then also want the perfect infinitive passive when you want it to be the passive pluperfect. So we're going to cut now back to the infinitive study guide to look and see what the difference between the perfect active infinitive will look like versus the perfect passive. So going back to the infinitive study guide, remember that the active is going to look like the following: isse, amawisse, widisse, misisse, audiwisse. And if we wanted a pluperfect active subjunctive, all we would have to do is to put on the end of it mst, mus, tis, nt. And over here, if we wanted a pluperfect passive, you would then take the perfect passive infinitive and again put mst, mus, tis, nt. You use the active endings because onto the verb to be essa, you can only have active endings. And so when we go back to the study guide for subjunctives, it's all laid out here. Active, amawisim, which is, again, the perfect infinitive, active, plus your ending m. And over here, if we isolate actus esse, that is the passive perfect infinitive, and then we just put it on the ending m. So actus essem, actus esses, actus esset, acti essemus. Again, I had to make the participle also plural to have subject-verb agreement. Acti essetes and acti essent versus over here. You can see, looking at them hopefully, as to why they are easy to recognize. The active particularly, you will be able to see isse in there. And you see with egesem, egeses, egeset, audiwisem, audiwises, audiwiset, and so forth and so on. And hopefully with the pluperfect passive. So, quick overview again. I would argue that the most difficult to recognize is the present tense. Why? Because when you have the vowel, various vowels could appear in different moods, depending upon what conjugation it is. E, of course, the A, of course, and also you have to know what conjugation it is to determine the easiest, I would argue, imperfect and pluperfect, and then that leaves the perfect in that when it comes to the active, you won't know whether it is a future perfect indicative or perfect subjunctive unless you look at the context. So, once again, if you were to look at all of these forms, every single one except for first person singular could be either one out of context. It's when you put it in context will you know. And then, of course, for the perfect passive, you just have to know the forms of, instead of sum sumus estis sunt that you would have for indicative, you have sim sis sit simus sitis sint for the subjunctive. So hopefully this helps you to understand a little bit more. There are going to be more walkthroughs to come, hopefully, and that is it for now.